I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. My name is Emma Kami, and I'll be your host today. Recent weeks have seen speculation that a Ukrainian offensive may be imminent. There have also been new raids by anti-Putin groups into Russia and signs that the Wagner Group's feud with Russia's Ministry of Defense is continuing. Here to make sense of it all and what it means for the future of the war is Matthew Orr, Eurasia Analyst at RANE. Welcome, Matthew.
Hey, Emma. It's a pleasure to be here.
So to start us off, what is the latest information regarding Ukraine's preparations for a potential offensive, and what could that look like?
Yeah, so we don't receive, daily updates about how these things are going because obviously information about the preparations are very sensitive. What we do see in Ukrainian media, social media, are repeated reminders not to, film or publicize in any way information about military movements on the territory of Ukraine, things like the movement of vehicles, other equipment needed for the offensive. That itself is a sign that these preparations are still underway. But what is definitely in the public sphere is information about new weapon systems that the Ukrainians are getting. Particularly notable of late are these Storm Shadow missiles, which are an an air-to-ground missile that the Ukrainians received a couple weeks ago. That is actually a potential game changer in the way that it will not only increase Ukraine's potential strike range, but would be a very effective weapon to use against all kinds of infrastructure that would have previously been out of range, things like airfields, other bunkers, and of course, as has been much talked about, it's a potential weapon that could be used against the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is of course what connects Crimea with the rest of Russia. So that in itself, that announcement is also a very notable sign that a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive could be imminent. As far as what the offensive would look like, we tend to think that the ultimate target of the offensive is going to be in the Zaporizhia region. There's a couple reasons for that. It's pretty clear that the offensive will have elements and actions taking place along most, if not all, of the front. One reason for this is that the Ukrainians don't want to keep the main thrust of their offensive secret until relatively late. They also are going to try these multiple attempts to break through the Russian lines. And then are really going to, adapt their offensive based off of how things go, where these breakthroughs are more or less successful. So there's definitely a certain amount of flexibility, but ultimately, an attack due south through Zaporizhia is really the place that's most likely to give Ukraine the strategic benefits that make the offensive worth it. If we look at some of the other options, we can start, on the northern part of the front around in the Luhansk region around Kharkiv or to the east of Kharkiv. That's where the Russian positions are likely the least lightly defended in terms of the fewest numbers of troops and most likely the fewest number of built fortifications. The problem with attacking there is that it just builds a salient kind of deeper behind Russian lines that's actually quite exposed and doesn't really contain any strategically significant objects or geographic barriers that necessarily help the Ukrainians bring it into the war. Moreover, politically, it's not an area that taking would have any meaningful ripple effects inside Russia. Then if we go further down south, we can obviously get into the central Donbass region around Bakhmut, etc. There, an attack is also it's more likely than up around Luhansk to be the main thrust, but it also comes with kind of questionable strategic benefits that the Ukrainians could seek to push the front line away from Bakhmut, try to encircle or destroy many of these Wagner Group forces that have been entrenched around the city in recent weeks before they have time to really build the fortifications that we've seen in other parts of the front. Also, given the recent feud with Russia's Ministry of Defense, destroying some of these forces may have a particular political effect inside Russia that the Ukrainians might want to induce. But again, it's not clear that really taking any of any territories, cities, etc., in this area is enough to really get Ukraine that much closer to actually ending the war or winning it. And so therefore, it seems like an attack in the south is the most likely place. That's supported by some, circumstantial evidence that we've seen where these Russian occupation authorities have made a big deal about evacuating these areas and shown that they're likely going to leave them. Moreover, the south is really the place where Ukraine can take the strategic territories, objects, barriers, etc., that it needs to actually deal a defeat to Russia and actually trigger a lot of the political processes inside Russia that are necessary for Ukraine to win. So that's why they would most likely want to cut off the supply to Russian forces in the region by striking due south towards the Sea of Azov. Once those troops are isolated, then they can really set themselves up for future offensives to target other places like Crimea or turn back to the Donbass. The problem with this variant, of course, is that it's you could say the most likely area of attack, and so therefore it's not exactly clear that this is an area that they can easily move forward in. But really, I think that an attack in the south is what we're most likely to see.
Right. So much ink has been spilled about Wagner Group's head Yevgeny Prigozhin's feud with Russia's military leadership. There was another raid by anti-Putin militias into Russia in recent days. What happened, and is there any relationship between these developments and Ukraine's potential counteroffensive?
Yeah, but both of these topics have gotten a lot of media coverage recently. I think that they're both interesting to think about with regards to the future offensive. Let's start with these recent raids, the kind of more recent incident. I think that it's clear that while these were conducted by Russian citizens or people from Russia, this is clearly being done as part of an action related to the impending Ukrainian offensive. The idea is that having these anti-Putin forces conducting these raids into Russia creates just one more political military issue that the Russians need to think about because these raids are somewhat controversial inside Russia and draw a lot of backlash, which is why the Russian official authorities and rhetoric don't recognize. They try to downplay significantly the Russian origin of these militias conducting these attacks. They essentially just call them Ukrainians. They say that these are Ukrainian formations. And that's because they definitely want to gloss over and not draw attention to that idea that there's other people claiming to be Russians that claim to be taking and occupying areas of Russia because that creates a certain amount of pressure on the Kremlin. And so the idea is that the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is also responsible for protecting Russian lines in Ukraine, would now have to spend more resources to also better defend Russia's proper borders with Ukraine. And so even if it's not like, of course, the Russians would never take forces out of Ukraine to defend these parts of Russia, even various forces still training in Russia, or just other security forces in Russia that could be used in Ukraine at a future point might have to instead be used in these border areas. As far as the Russian Ministry of Defense and the controversy with Wagner, I think that's a place that the Ukrainians are definitely watching with close intent. Ukrainian officials often comment on Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group, and try to really continue the controversy and fuel the controversy because they think that it's a way to politically kind of destabilize and upset Russia ultimately in the future. Although, to be perfectly frank, I'm skeptical that we're going to see this feud blow up in such a way that it actually has meaningful political effects inside Russia. I think the bigger effects of the feud are just the on the ground challenges that it's creating for the Russians. It's leading to a lot of competition and animus between Wagner and the Russian army, the regular army, and it's really hard to understand how that's actually beneficial to Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. You have distrust of leaders, distrust of soldiers from the other group, the fight for resources, etc. And so I tend to think that for a whole host of other reasons, the Russians are going to try to really limit that feud, although I don't think that'll be entirely successful, because I think that while the Wagner Group's role in Ukraine is going to fall, I think that they're still going to play a niche role in the Russia-Ukraine war. The Wagner forces, not being part of the Russian regular army, offer all kinds of benefits compared to regular Russian soldiers that we've detailed in a lot of our writing about this. And so, I think Prigozhin individually is motivated for several reasons to essentially continue the feud. So I think that that's not necessarily a good thing for the Russians ahead of this Ukrainian offensive.
And what exactly are your expectations for the counteroffensive, and how does it figure into the overall trajectory of the war?
Yeah, I mean, I'm somewhat, I, like a lot of people, are definitely, it could go a lot of ways. There's just an inherently large amount of uncertainty in military operations, particularly with regards to Russian morale. We just don't know how some of these Russian mobilized. I want to emphasize that point. A lot of these Russian soldiers are mobilized now that are manning these front areas. It's hard to say kind of what their motivation and training, how quality those things are, and how that will reflect in their willingness to defend. But that being said, I think it's, we definitely need to check our expectations, specifically in the South, if that is indeed going to be the thrust of Russian efforts. It's a very well defended area that they've made a multi-echelon defensive structure there and built fortifications. So I'm somewhat skeptical that we're going to see, rapid Ukrainian gains that we saw in Ukraine's previous offensives around Kherson and Kharkiv. But I tend to think that, the Ukrainians have a lot of modern equipment and a lot of mobilized soldiers with, relatively high motivation. Hopefully that high motivation can compensate for their somewhat limited training, although that training was conducted, with NATO instructors. And so I think we'll see. I think that we can expect the Ukrainians to make some modest gains. And what I want to emphasize here is that I think modest gains, can have major strategic benefits for Ukraine. They don't have to get that far to really complicate the Russian logistical situation in the south even further, and they don't really have to get that far in order to, continue to build political controversy about the war in Russia and force more Russian mobilization measures which are unpopular, etc. At the same time, I am kind of skeptical that this offensive on its own is going to be enough for the Ukrainians to put the entire war on a trajectory that means they're going to win. There's still a lot of doubts about the West's ability to support Ukraine in the long term. That's being brought up even more recently as we go into this NATO summit with Ukraine that's supposed to take place in July. And there's been a lot of talk about the future of Western support for Ukraine. The problem is that a lot of that support, as of right now, is being doled out on essentially on a 1 year fiscal year basis in a lot of these budgeting documents, instead of how military support, for example, by the United States to other countries such as Israel works, where a lot of that military support is locked in years, up to 10 years in advance. And so I think what would go a long way in really changing the Russians' calculus and making the Ukrainians much more likely to actually emerge victorious in the war overall would be for the United States in particular, and of course other NATO allies and the wider world, to really think about how they're going to preemptively lock in a lot of military support for Ukraine, not just on a 1 year basis, but on a 5-10 year basis, because that's something that could actually put the war on a different trajectory and change the Russians' calculus.
Well, thanks very much for that analysis, Matthew. You can learn how geopolitical events like this could affect your business with RANE Worldview. Our flagship risk intelligence products provide clients with the access to the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions and drive better risk management outcomes. Sign up at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.